This video is for you if you're preparing for the OCR Latin GCSE current, and by current I mean the specification that started in 2018 and is still running. We've got a new government now, so who knows what's around the corner, but if you are currently studying Latin, this should be fine for you. So this is specifically focusing on the grammar questions in the language paper because it's a really easy win, and I'm going to show you how you can get full marks in the grammar questions. My name is Emma Williams. I was a Latin teacher full-time in schools for 21 years, and then about 3 years ago I left the chalk face and I'm now a full-time tutor, and my website is there on the screen. So let's make a start. Basic facts about the grammar questions in the language paper. They are worth 10%, so that's 10 marks out of 100 on the exam paper. So if you think about it, that is well over a grade difference in that particular paper. It's a lot of marks. It's the only question on the exam paper that is optional, in that you either do the grammar questions or you do some English into Latin sentences, and the examiners say that you can do both. You may well be aware that you have a frankly insane amount of time to complete the language paper, so unless you work very, very slowly, vast majority of students find that they have too much time in the language exam. My advice would be to do one, and I would advise you to do the grammar questions, not the English to Latin, purely because although the English to Latin sentences are very simple, the room for error is great. You get one letter wrong in the word that you're doing and you lose the mark for that word. So you might have what I would consider to be a pretty good stab at them, but still get quite a low mark. The grammar questions are much easier. So my advice would be to do the grammar questions, complete the entire paper, check the entire paper really carefully, and only then, when and if you find you have the spare time, consider doing the English to Latin. It should not be something you do as a habit. Okay, get the whole paper done first, and only if it's literally do those or die of boredom, then feel free to do the English to Latin as well. That would be my personal advice. One very common way that the questions are worded in the GCSE is identify an example of or pick out. Now these basically mean the same thing. So pick out on the language paper a word and make sure that you are looking at the line that you are instructed to pick from. Here's some examples of the simplest types of questions. So identify or pick out an example of the nominative or accusative case. That's often used as the first question. Not always, but quite often. The first question is a very simple pick out an example of a nominative, pick out an example of an accusative in line 1. It's often the way the examiner starts. Alternatively, the examiner might ask you to pick out an adjective, perhaps a superlative adjective, which of course could be an irregular one, so you need to make sure that you've learned those. Likewise, pick out an adverb or a pronoun. Now with the adverbs, they can be quite tricky to identify if you haven't revised the list of adverbs specifically. So I advocate for learning the vocabulary list in parts of speech, so that's in types of words. So you might, for example, revise all your first declension nouns together, you might revise all your irregular verbs together, and definitely revise all the adverbs together so that you can be clear in your mind, okay, these are adverbs, and therefore I am confident picking out those in a grammar question. A pronoun, it could specify personal pronoun, that's words like I, you, me, or it could specify relative pronoun, which is always who or which, so qui, quae, quod in Latin. One of the examiner's favourite questions is identify the case, identify the tense, or identify the form of. So let's look at those a little bit more closely. So in its simplest, identify the tense of, and they will give you a verb to identify the tense of. Noticeably, it's often the imperfect tense, but again, not always. But it is something I've noticed that the examiner seems to favour. Another favourite question is identify the form of and say why that form is used here. It's a real favourite of the examiners. So that's always worth 2 marks. And what he's looking for is the form is the infinitive, and the reason it is in the infinitive, which is why the form is used, is because it's used with, and then all you've got to do is go hunting for the main verb in the sentence that requires an infinitive, and it will be the same in English as in Latin. So in English we say I am able to, I want to, I decide to, I prefer to, I ought to. All of those verbs we in English follow with the infinitive, and they work the same in Latin. So you're looking out for possum, wallow, nollo, mallow, debeo, and all those sorts of words. Any word that requires an infinitive after it in English, then it'll be the same in Latin. So just go looking for the main verb that makes sense to be followed in English with an infinitive. Identify the case of is also a favourite of the examiners, so we'll look at some examples of that. And his most favourite version of that is identify the case of and say why this case is used. And in that scenario, most often it's because the noun is accusative or ablative after a preposition. So the examiner might pick out the phrase ad willam, identify the form of willam and say why this case is used. You would say it's accusative because it follows a preposition. Very straightforward. However, that's not the only example of that kind of question, so we will look at some others too. One real favourite question of the examiner is based on uses of the subjunctive. He has asked this in every single language paper so far, every single time. So it's the one question that keeps coming up again and again. So let's take a look. Now, I have a bit of an issue with the examiner's use of the word explain here, because I fear it's a bit of a trigger word for students who are studying other subjects, history, English, whatever, anything that requires you to write at length. You will have seen that word explain, and your teacher in that subject will have drilled you in how to do that, and it will be all sorts of things like you need to make at least 3 points or you need to use evidence. Well, none of that applies here. So I think the use of the word explain is a bit foolish by the examiner and will potentially send candidates into a spiral of panic. It simply means which construction, which use of the subjunctive is used in this sentence. So your answer will be 1 or 2 words, because it's going to be indirect command, result clause, purpose clause, cum clause, fear clause, or indirect question. That's it. You don't need to write in a full sentence, you just give the answer. So I think the use of the word explain is ridiculous. So if your subjunctive verb is used with ut, and what do you know, it's perhaps the examiner's favourite to choose a sentence where it's a subjunctive after ut, well, you can't just say that. You can't just say because it follows ut, you'll get 0 for that. You have to give one of the 3 possible answers for ut plus the subjunctive, which is either indirect command, result clause, or purpose clause. So if you're not sure, at least guess one of those 3, because you've got a 33.3 recurring percentage chance of getting it right. Indirect command is where you order, beg, persuade, ask somebody to do something, and you translate your ut as to. For example, the master ordered the slaves to work. The master asked the slaves to work. The master begged the slaves to work. Those all count as indirect command. Result clause is quite different. That's where you're looking out for a so word. The master was so angry that he could barely speak. The slaves were so tired that they could no longer work. That's a result clause. And then a purpose clause is quite similar to the indirect command. They're easy to mix up, but the test for it is, are you translating your ut with a sense of purpose in order to, or so that they could? For example, the slave girls entered the kitchen in order to prepare dinner, or the slave girls entered the kitchen so that they could prepare dinner. That's a purpose clause. So ut plus subjunctive is one of those three. Alternative uses of the subjunctive. Cum clause, well, what do you know? There'll be the word cum in it. You translate the cum as when or since. When the soldiers had killed the enemy, they were delighted. A fear clause, now it's likely to be the word timeo that you're looking out for. That's on the language list as meaning to fear. There is also the verb tereo, which means frighten, and so you could have that in the passive, frightened by somebody else. So if you spot that you've got a fear verb and then it's followed by ne and the subjunctive, then that's a fear clause. The soldiers were afraid that the enemies would kill them. Finally, if none of those apply, you probably have an indirect question. They're perhaps the hardest to spot. I find students find them difficult. So it could be, it doesn't have to have a question word, because it could be something like the soldiers wondered where the slaves were. So wondered doesn't sound like it's triggering a question, but it does. So any situation in which you have a question reported, that's an indirect question. But if you're not sure about them, if there's no ut, there's no cum, and there's no ne, it must be an indirect question. So let's look at some examples, and what I've done is taken a passage from a very old paper, so prior to the current specification, because I don't want to use any current papers that your teacher might use for a test or anything like that. So we're using a really old paper from prior to when the specification changed, and I've created some questions in the style of the current GCSE. So here's the passage that I'm taking the questions from. Now what we're going to be doing is quite challenging, because remember, in the exam the grammar questions are based on a passage that you've already looked at. You will have already answered some comprehension questions about it, so it will already be familiar. So one top tip is, if you get stuck on a grammar question, do go back and look at it in the context of what you've already done. Find the bit where you were answering questions on that section. You may well have already translated it as you were going. Yeah, so look back at your work, and remember also to look back to help with any underlined words. So if you're puzzling over the answer to a grammar question and you're stuck for, well, what was this bit about again? Go back, use the given vocabulary. So use all the tools that are there. Remember how much time you've got in this exam. So don't rush it. Don't just think, oh, I don't know. Go back and use what's there to help you. So if you did want to have a go at looking at this passage in detail, obviously you can pause this video and translate it, but there's no need. So here is how the examiner might start. Identify or pick out an example of the nominative case in line 1. As I say, he often starts like this, and often there are multiple answers to the question. So in this case, you could have the name. Okay, names count because they have cases just like any other noun. So here's another name, and then obviously Rex. That's perhaps the most obvious one that would jump out to most students. So a nice gentle start, and a lot of the examiners do start with something nice and easy for the first question. Often the examiner will ask about the tense of a particular verb. Here he's asking for a future in line 2. So here you would have dabis or idifficabit. Again, there's more than one possibility, and remember that is often the case. So do go looking for all the possible answers and make sure you pick the one that you're most sure about. Don't pick the one that you're uncertain about. Another real favourite of the examiner is picking out an adverb, and what I've done here is deliberately pick one that I think students would find it hard to recognise as an adverb unless they'd learnt it as such. So here you've got tamen in line 4, however. Now I think most students would struggle to recognise that as an adverb because we tend to think of adverbs as solely saying how you do a verb. So happily, daintily, smugly, quickly. Everybody always thinks of those as, okay, that's an adverb. But the definition's a lot broader than that. So remember, adverbs describe or qualify verbs. So, for example, they might tell you when a verb is done. So if you were asked about line 1, you've got olim, once or one day. That's an adverb. In line 4, which is what we were asked about, we've got tamen, but we've also got igitur, therefore. That, in a similar way to however, qualifies the verb and its action. So it does count as an adverb. So my advice is, best thing to do, learn the adverbs, get on Quizlet. You can use my free resources on there. Look up Latin tutor E. Williams on Quizlet and you'll find all of my sets on there. So learn the adverbs as adverbs so that you can confidently identify them in a situation like this. Okay, so we've also got another favourite of the examiners here, which is identify the form of punire and say why this form is used. So he loves this question. It's a real favourite and it's always for 2 marks. So here we've got the phrase that's relevant in line 6. Now, remember what I said previously, the form is always infinitive. Okay, notice it ends in re, that's what regular infinitives do in Latin, although, of course, if he's feeling really mean, he might pick an irregular, but I doubt it. So ends in re, it's an infinitive, and why it's used, all you have to do is go looking for the verb that requires the infinitive. Now, top tip, he often actually quotes that in the question. So watch out for that. If you're struggling, have a look at what he's given you. So here we've got constituit, which means he decided, and just like in English, he decided to, it requires the infinitive. So all you have to say is it's the infinitive because it's used with constituit. Quote the verb exactly as it is on the paper rather than trying to remember what its original dictionary form is. That's considered fine and it minimises your risk of getting anything wrong. So just literally copy what's on the paper and you'll be fine. Do you use the phrase used with rather than goes with? Because goes with, if you think about it in Latin, means something quite specific. So that really means is in the same case, tense, number as. So don't use goes with, use used with. So it's in the infinitive because it's used with. In this case, it's constituent, but it might be possum, able to, wallow, want to, nollo, don't want to, mallow, prefer to, anything, any verb that needs an infinitive. Okay, so that one's straightforward. And then this is another favourite, identify the case and say why it's used. Now I mentioned a favourite of the examiners is accusative or ablative after a preposition, and actually a good 80% of the time that's what the answer is, so worth watching out for, but not every single time. Sometimes it's something that requires a bit more thought. So that's what you've got here, and it's another favourite of his, the dative. This has come up quite a few times over the years. And wherever you've got a verb that has got giving or handing over, bear in mind you're very likely to have a dative because you're going to be giving or handing over something to somebody. There's your dative. So here we've got tradidit, that means handed over. And what did he hand over? The dona promissa, the promised gifts. And then deis, to the gods, that's your dative. Okay, so all you have to do in a question like this, if he asks why, The examiner's very happy for you just to say because it means, just give him the translation. So all you have to say is it's in the dative because it means to the gods. Tick. He's happy with that. If you come from a school where grammar is taught in quite a formal way, you may have been taught that this is called the indirect subject. Correct, that would be correct as well. But you don't actually need those technical terms. You can just tell the examiner how it translates, and he's fine with that. So finally, let's look at an example of his regular question, comes up every single time. Why consumerette, in this case, is in the subjunctive mood. So here is the sentence in question, and notice it's after ut. Remember, you cannot say, because it follows ut, that will get you a guaranteed 0. So don't bother writing it down, there's no point. If you're not sure, and you really struggle with this, especially if this is like the night before the exam, then just learn that your options are purpose clause, indirect command, or result clause, if it's after ut. Okay, those are the 3. So then at least if you write one of those, you've got some hope of getting the answer right. If you have got time to prep in more detail, revise the uses of the subjunctive. You have got here, he sent a huge snake to Troy. Remember, you'd go back and look up the vocabulary from earlier in the paper if you needed help with that. Ut puellas consumerat, to or in order to eat girls. Okay, a classic example of the weird passages that you get in Latin. Clearly this is a purpose clause. There's a sense of purpose, to or in order to. Okay, so this is a purpose clause, and that's your answer. A 2-word answer. Remember, the use of the word explain is not significant like it is in other subjects. That's my whistle-stop tour through the GCSE OCR grammar questions. Hope you found it useful. If you do want to get in touch with me, I will see your comments if you put them on YouTube. It's about the only social media channel that I do get involved with. Alternatively, if you wanted to get in touch with me directly, then you can find how to do so via my website. See you soon.